Hello, thank you, Trudy. Thank you to our Dean. As the chair of the Lecture and Events Committee for this year, I'd like to welcome you again in one of our lectures. The theme for this year is Future by Design. So I'm going to go briefly reading the theme. So new AI tools allow for design experimentation, but also raise questions regarding new forms of agency and knowledge transfer in design. Intelligence is not only embedded in the computational tools one uses to design and make, but also in matter itself. Embedded smart systems in products and environments facilitate communication and enhance interactions, making matter responsive to individual needs. Questions of control and privacy arise that future designers must tackle. In addition, the urgent matter of climate change forces designers and scholars to rethink materials, manufacturing, and production processes. This year's lecture series reflect on current and future challenges in design practices and research, questioning existing models, imagining desired modes of creation, and highlighting the social responsibility of the designers of the future. So I'd like to welcome Francesca Forlini, who's a faculty in the School of Architecture, to introduce our event.
Thank you, Athena, and well, good evening. Francesca Forlini, visiting assistant professor here at the School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. I will take a few minutes to introduce the symposium and our speakers, and will later on moderate the debate. I'd like to thank Trudy Benz for her introduction, also Dean Maria Perbellini, who is particularly active in promoting the work of women in our field, the audience, both in person and online, and the lectures and event team. Sue is here. Thanks so much for everything. And of course, the speakers who so generously agreed to join me tonight. Among the audience, there are also my fifth-year students. Hello. Since the symposium is part of the Advanced History and Theory of Architecture seminar that I'm teaching here, which questions theories of inhabitation. Not by chance, post-anthropocentric architectural futures tackled architecture's relation to life, among which the question of inhabitation stands out. Inhabitation and cohabitation between humans and other species will be discussed tonight, expanding architectural thinking beyond its humanist foundations. Indeed, the Anthropocene's residues of human intervention are irremediably altering the Earth's geophysical properties. These processes include the implementation of architectural projects in new cities. They're fueled by natural resources extraction and result in the production and accumulation of waste. So this new geological era are also associated environmental catastrophes caused by the anthropogenic pressures on the planet's ecology and the endless series of unsustainable human practices that are taking place. The scenario suggests a necessary paradigm shift in architectural thinking, both in theory and in practice. Spatial designers informed by philosophy and environmental studies are indeed questioning the anthropocentric basis of their work. But what are the conceptual tools, the theories, and subsequently design solutions that critically and comprehensively respond to the challenges brought by this new era? Shall we achieve species egalitarianism by integrating non-human biological life into the design process? Do green, sustainable architecture and planning suffice, or shall we rely once again on philosophy to regain a new, fresh perspective on architectural theory and practice in order to propose daring design solutions that finally resolve architecture's conflicted relationship with nature? Our speakers will try to guide us through these questions, proposing their unique perspectives on these topics. We will start from philosophy to then delve into architectural theory and lastly explore innovative design solutions. So please stay with us until the end. The first contribution is from philosopher Francesca Ferrando, who will introduce posthuman philosophy and post-anthropocentrism and will be generous enough to apply her knowledge and introduce posthuman design and multi-species architecture. Catherine Ingram will follow and will dive into the complex relationship between architecture and nature in her lecture on Ordering the Time of Chaos. The metabolic home is Livia Kalipodides' own architectural ecosystem, or as I dared calling it once, an unintentional manifesto for a more than human architecture. And of course, also the subject of her presentation. Our guests' lectures will be concise to allow space for a moderated debate after. And I ask the audience to keep their questions for later, as a Q&A session will follow. I'll introduce each speaker right before the presentation to allow the necessary time to set up the podium. So we start off with Francesca Ferrando. Francesca Ferrando is a professor of philosophy at NYU Liberal Studies. Is a philosopher, lecturer, and translated author, and above all, a leading voice in the field of posthuman studies. I know she will introduce herself and tell us a little bit more about herself, but let me say that Dr. Ferrando holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Roma Tre in Italy, received an MA in gender studies at Utrecht University, directed by Rosi Bredotti, is the recipient of the Philosophical Prize Premio Sainati with the acknowledgement of the President of the Italian Republic, and is also author of several publications, including Philosophical Posthumanism. And there is an upcoming book published by Polity titled The Art of Being Posthuman. And I think she'll tell us a little bit more about it in a minute. She's also the founder of the Global Posthuman Network. So help me welcoming Francesca.
I can ask a couple of questions.
Yes.
All right. So while we are getting our slides on, first of all, hi, everyone. I want to say that you are in the right place at the right time because you are talking about the future of architecture. This is the only way we can go on as a species. So it is a big deal. It is a big topic. And we have a lot of great minds here who are going to shape the future of architecture. So I'm very pleased and honored to be here. I want to make sure that what we talk about today is going to be extremely clear to everyone. So just to double check a little bit on the language, how many people have heard, understand a little bit the meaning of post-human? How many people are familiar with this topic? I'm asking to make sure that I am not going into details that are not relevant. Okay, so 20%. And how many people understand the notion of anthropocentrism? Anthropocentrism. Half of you. All right, that's very helpful. I'm going to make sure to explain everything very clearly, and we can start. First of all, I want to say that the reason why I am interested in this topic in architecture is about self-knowledge. I realized that if I want to know who I am, I cannot only ask who I am through my mind, but I have to understand my embodied being, who I am in embodied ways. And who I am is not just my biological body, but is everything that surrounds us. In fact, if you think, for instance, of Chinese philosophy, the notion of background does not exist. If you think of ancient paintings, for instance, Chinese painting, everything is the landscape. There is not a main face. There is not the main character. Everything is part of something else. I want to say this because the reason why I'm here is because I think that what you're doing is key to posthumanism. So I come from a philosophical background. This has been 20 years of my career. And now it's happening. Now the discussion is getting outside of academia. It's getting outside of the realm of notion and ideas. We need to rethink how are we going to build something that can be considered posthuman or can be considered post-anthropocentric. And by the way, why is anthropocentrism a problem? So let's do like this. I'm going to share with you some images. They were all generated through DAL-E, which is a generative AI system. So these are buildings that do not exist. I created some notions, and then I got some proposals by the system, and I chose some of them. I'm going to go through this journey, talking about why we are talking about this journey. But at the end of the conversation, I'm going to ask two main questions to you. And I want you to think about this and have a dialogue. So let's start with the title, which is, of course, Post-Anthropocentric Architectural Future. And I think that this is extremely important, and I want to thank Francesca for organizing this, because if we want to go on as a species, the only way we can do it is acknowledging that our privilege as a species no longer suit us. Is actually, at this point of historical times, in the era of the Anthropocene, to think that we still have privileges as a species is actually killing us. We are in an ecological crisis, and as a philosopher, I see the root of that in our mindset. I don't see the root of that in our habits. The habits are ethos, are ethics, are reflection of what we believe in. And so I really believe, and this is why I'm a philosopher, that our mindset can change our existing realities. And so in that sense, I believe that architecture can only go this way. So what does post-anthropocentric mean? Let's go to some images. I know that some people think through words, other people think through images, and they can be a little useful to have a conversation. Again, these are not real buildings. They do not exist, okay? So we are going to talk about all of these. I want to mention that I do have a bunch of books. I'm going to read some passages from my upcoming book, which is called The Art of Being Posthuman. Who are we in the 21st century? And in this book, I do address architecture, I do address engineering, but the core of the book itself is self-knowledge. And this is why I'm here. I'm not interested in architecture just for architecture. I'm interested in architecture as a way to understand who we are. And this is at the core of this book that is coming up. Actually, in the United States, it's going to come out in January. And these are other books. Philosophical Posthumanism is, if you're interested in philosophy and posthumanism, I highly advise that. It is very clear to understand a little more of transhumanism, posthumanism, metahumanism, etc., etc. And this is my website, theposthuman.org. Feel free to contact me. We also have a very active network of scholars worldwide, from Pakistan to India to Venezuela to Morocco. And so it would be wonderful to expand the discussion. This must be a global discussion and a local discussion. Otherwise, it's not posthuman, because the human has to be comprehensive of who we are. And as a species, we come in many different varieties, different genders and ethnicities and ideas, nationality, races, etc., etc. So feel free to contact me. As I mentioned, these are all images that have been generated by DALL-E. Again, it is a text-to-image model. All right, so of course, when we talk about architecture, we can think of so many possible ways. I'm going to focus specifically on urban designs, cities, because we are in a city right now. We are in one of the main cities in the United States, and I would even claim worldwide, New York City. And I want to really be loyal to who we are right here, right now. I don't want to go into any utopia. I'm not here to talk about utopias. I'm not interested in those, because they come from Greek. It means no place. Utopos, topos place, no place. I'm interested in where we are right here, right now, maybe utopias. So when we think of cities, what should we think of? I went back to the origin of architecture, and along with Mesopotamia, I would have some answers. There are question marks, because you may agree or not with them. But let's go to some places that we might consider important when we're talking about architecture. I would think that homes are something that is important. I would think that schools are something that is important. We are right here in a school. You are in this place. You are right now part of this place. You are a network in this place. You are not a human being inside of a building. This is it. This is the horizon that is happening. It's the network of you being part of this through the interconnection that are happening. Squares, that's very classical of ancient times, and it's still nowadays something Columbus Circle, think of that, a public space where people meet. Temples and shrines. I'm not only talking about religious buildings. I'm thinking of places places where the sacred can be implemented. Businesses, bathhouses, which can be simply access to water. Data centers, and I'm underlining data centers, because at the moment, data centers to me are the highest example of anthropocentric thinking. These are buildings where absolutely no biological entities can be in touch with, apart from the few humans working on that. So if we have time, we're going to go more into data centers. And I want some of you, maybe for your research thesis, to think of a post-anthropocentric data center. How would that look like? What kind of technology do we need to think of? But that's another point that we're going to open at the end. All right, so also, how can we achieve that in post-anthropocentric post-human ways. Of course, this is not comprehensive of all the topics we can address, but I would say that we must think of an integration between the human and the non-human. Of course, I'm not talking of the human and the non-human as a dichotomy. I'm talking of an expansion of the notion of beings. So if we're thinking of cities, usually they're thought for humans. There are steps for humans. There are businesses for humans. There are elevators for humans. What about, for instance, birds that migrate from one country to another? What about turtles that come and lay their eggs on the shores of North Carolina? What about all the animals that are part of our collective planet right now? Because we're not the only one living on this planet. And furthermore, this planet is not ours. It's our embodiment. And on this, I would like to quote Alan Watts, who was this Zen philosopher, one of the founders of the California Institute of Integral Studies. And he used to say that the human is like an apple, like the fruit, the apple. Now it's apple season upstate, apples. And it is exactly like a fruit coming out of the earth. And I like this metaphor a lot because it makes us think of us as fruits of the earth, not a place that we live on, but we are made out of the planet Earth. But now we are not the only ones. And so what about all the others that we don't think when we think of building a school or building a temple or building a data center? So I want to think really, I would say probably because of time, this is going to be my main question to you all. How can you rethink cities, including non-human animals? And I'm not only talking about rats and cockroaches, that we have a lot of them in New York City. We're familiar with them. What about all the others, all the other animals? What about technology? What about eco-technology? What about a type of technology that doesn't pollute the earth, but is integral part of the earth? And there is much more to talk about technology. We will see how much we are doing with time, how we are doing with time, but technology is key in our era. But what kind of technology are we talking about? Example, electric cars. Well, cobalt is an ore, a precious ore that is needed for electric cars. What about the mining of the minerals that we need for so-called sustainable technologies? What about all of it? What about the people working to for instance, in the mines? I'm thinking, for instance, of Congo, in Africa. What about the whole cycle, not just the end result? Can we do that? Can we think about everything? Can we think about the roots and the body of the tree and the leaves and everything? Can we think of the full cycle? And that's what I'm going to ask you to do. Not just the final outcome, not just the building that you're going to create, not just that design that you're going to envision. What about everything? Where do the material come from? Who harvests them? What about the cycle of nature? I want to ask you to think of technology in these expanded ways. What about the rights of nature? And this is very interesting because 2008, we had the first case, and that was in Ecuador. Ecuador recognized in their constitution the rights of nature. It was the first time in the history of law where a country recognized a non-human entity as bearer of rights. So for instance, if you're polluting a river, you can be brought to the judges and you can be in trouble. There are issues with this. So you see the humans, like reflecting and talking about the issue itself. The river cannot talk, but it is a big step. And this is happening in many other countries, New Zealand, India, et cetera, et cetera. So I want you to think about a city that respects the rights of nature. What about existential dignity for everyone involved? What about post-human awareness? And when I'm talking about post-human awareness, I'm talking about the question, who am I? And when I'm thinking about who am I, this I will never be ending through some thoughts that come to my mind. I need the air to breathe, and the air that I'm breathing right is the same that you are breathing, and the same air that has been, breathed by so many people before us, and is created by the plants and the ocean. It is a cycle. We are part of a cycle. So with these kind of premises, we can think of possibilities. Well, let's first start with living spaces. I think this is something major. If you are living in a healthy place, your health is going to be good. If you live in a place that is not healthy, doesn't have to be necessarily physical, could be psychological, a lot of distress in your household or living spaces. How can we achieve a place of health, integral health? And so I thought of possibilities. Again, these places do not exist. I thought about the integration of sustainable technology, the elements of nature, but this is still supposed to be in a city. So what I'm underlining here is that what I hope maybe not to see anymore in the future is a city where you're walking and you know that you're in a city. What if we could be in a city, forgetting that we are in a city? We are walking and we think we are in the mountains because everything surrounding us smells good, and the variety of beings and the air, the freshness of the air. This is the air we are breathing. This is like main food for our own body. What about possibility of, you're going to see the water coming through many of these images. Water is at the beginning of civilization. So architecture is born out of the meeting of humans with places with water. Think of the Indus Valley civilization, which was connected to the Indus River. Think of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Think of the Nile in Egypt. All the major civilization, and think of course the Yellow River in China, all the major civilization of the past were connected to water. And in fact, in the Tao, water is considered the metaphor of the perfect balance of life, because water can be vapor, can be ice, can be liquid, and it's still water. It doesn't lose its integrity. And when humans were asked, there was this interesting survey in 2017, and they asked a bunch of people, I don't remember the number, when do you feel human? 70% of the people said when they were in water. Maybe because we are born in water and thinking of being in the belly of the mother, but this is very interesting that water is so connected to who we are. How are we doing with time? How much left? 5 minutes, all right, perfect. So let's go to the public spaces, squares. This is an interesting idea of a space where the human space is not separated from non-human spaces. So of course, here we can think of insects, of birds, of many other animals that could be coexisting. What I've been really understanding is that one of the ways we can think of New York City is, for instance, expanding, for instance, the presence of non-human entities. For instance, I'm thinking now of plants. Urban gardens are excellent also for energy reasons. And I'm not only thinking of horizontal gardens, but vertical ones. Look at this next image. So this, for instance, is a wall and it's covered. Now this, you could be upstate, and I live upstate. I moved with the pandemic. I used to be in New York City. And with the pandemic, I moved upstate. This could be upstate, but this behind it, think of a wall. Think of something that used to be concrete and now it's been transformed. New York City is doing it. There has been a lot of transformation. I've been here since 2009 and I've been witnessing that, but we need more. We need you to implement more of this. We need a city in which you are walking around and you think you're in the forest. What about thinking, for instance, for instance, places where you can also grow food. And this is very big in Italy. Rome is a capital, and there are many urban gardens where people actually cultivate their own food. And that, of course, can help from, if you think also of sustainability, health, economics, in an era where a lot of jobs are getting lost. Spaces of worship. I want to underline here that we're not talking about temples. We're talking about a place when you can be in silence and reconnect. That's it. This is another example. This could be, now you look at this, it could be a Zen building, we could be in Japan, it could be in New York City, it could be 60 seconds. There could be a wall behind that, but now you are somewhere else. This is again some other example. Again, none of these buildings exist, of possibilities. Again, a shrine that could be part of a building where actually people live. We don't have to think in such divided spaces, in such dichotomic ways. Places of worship used to be the place where the humans used to live. That's going back to the ancient beginning. Keynes insights, water is extremely important. Without water, we don't survive. And in many cultures, you have places where you can have access to water. In many cultures, it's very important to the purifying. Think of Islam. Before praying, you need to wash your hands, your feet. Think, for instance, of Hinduism. Think of Christianity, baptism. Water is essential. So what about places where water is running? And I'm thinking of interesting places in New York where water is used also in evocative and sacred ways. I'm thinking of the September 11, you can call it a place of remembrance or actually a shrine where you go and there are these huge spaces where water is running and remember all the people who lost their lives. And it's very evocative. If you've not been there yet, go. Because as an architecture, you need to witness the space. And the use of the water there is brilliant. And there are other examples, schools. This is, I wanted to show you how I did it. This was the prompt that I give, a visionary low-impact school in the shape of a spiral DNA and of a kaleidoscope made of organic material, mimetically located in the mountains. And we have other example of schools that are possible ideas. The idea, of course, of going with the shape of the environment. And the last thing I would like to address here, because of time, is the questions that I have for you. And those are extremely important. Before doing that, let's underline materials. They are essential. You need to think of your materials. You need to be creative. Again, I gave some possible prompts. Organic architecture made of bioengineered living material. Keep in mind that if you are living material, that might affect your own body. So that's something that we need to explore more. But mushrooms are being used now, for instance, for bioengineered living materials. These are some more examples of that. And then, most importantly, our vision quest on the urban posthuman. And these two questions are for you. And I want you to keep deeply within you in these 3 or 4 years of university. And when you are done, if you do develop a nice project, let us know, because these are fundamental. The first one is, how can our cities, besides of existential dignity for humans and non-humans alike, how would that look like? How would be a place of dignity for birds migrating, passing through New York? And at the moment, they have no place to go. They often go in very polluted spaces because that's the only spaces where there is some vegetation, there are no humans. And the second question is, even maybe most important, how can spaces evoke post-human awareness? And when I'm talking about post-human awareness, I simply mean who we are in expanded, comprehensive way. You, as an individual, as a society, as a species, as a planet, and beyond. And so I believe I don't have time to read from my book, but that's okay. Is that correct? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And very exciting to be here.
Thanks so much, Francesca. This was very interesting. And thanks for trying to wear the architect's shoes as anticipated earlier. So I'm going to introduce the second speaker for today. That is Catherine Ingram. And I'm going to use another I'm going to move in the space. So Catherine Ingram is a tenured professor in the graduate program of architecture at Pratt Institute and a periodic visiting faculty member at the GSD Harvard University, GSUP Columbia University. Her publications include 3 books, Architecture and the Burdens of Linearity, Architecture, Animal, Human, and Architecture Theory that came out just recently, and include numerous essays. Dr. Ingram has lectured and presented papers at multiple national and international schools of architecture and was co-editor for 8 years with Michael Hayes and Alicia Kennedy of the critical journal Assemblage. She has won fellowships and awards, among them 2-year fellowship in the Chicago Institute of Architecture and Urbanism, 6-month fellowship in Canadian Center of Architecture in Montreal, other residencies and Grama Foundation grants, and she did her doctoral work at Johns Hopkins University. Help me welcome Kathy Ingram.
I'm afraid my talk is more depressing. It's it's yeah, it's I'm going to read it, but it doesn't exactly address the Anthropocene, post-Anthropocene, or the post-human, because I've found it very difficult when I'm thinking about those particular possibilities, that I always get stuck. I always get stuck somewhere in that idea. For the post-human, I get stuck around, sort of, you could say, the cognitive systems that each species hold on to rarely cross over. And so how you get them to cross over in some way is extremely, I think, would be highly curated, and possibly have to be a kind of technological function that would be operating in there in order to make that happen. And what that would be, I have no idea. So, and when I come to the post-Anthropocene, it seems to me the Anthropocene will probably, like every other epoch, run out of steam at some point. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we go back joyfully and create everything perfectly again and have done all our homework and have no more carbon problems and so forth. So I get stuck in these places, in these kind of hopes, that somehow this will pass and we will come out of it stronger and more smart and more aware and more conscious of the incredible diversity that Francesca has enthusiastically presented to us in the world. The incredible world, it's just unbelievable. And the fact that we even think that we want to destroy any of it ever, is kind of just incredible. It's suggestive of some sort of, other scope of, who we are or what identity means and other things. But I'm not really going to, so I'm not going to really get into that, but maybe the questions later will be interesting in response to Francesca's and Lydia's talk and our talks. What I'm going to do is just take us through what an essay I wrote a while ago that is actually in this new book. And it's about what's called biomodernity. And it's about how modernism contended with sort of the development of relationships to the biological human being. And so I'm going to, and that it bears on many things, but some of the things it bears on is how technology enabled that, and also where we are now in relationship to technology to some degree. And I totally agree with Francesca that we're not simply biological. But this is talking in a little bit around that through another philosopher's point of view on this, was Giorgio Agamben. And the latter part, and the images are not, I'm not going to say much about the images. I'll try to sort of scroll through them a little bit to sort of provide some entertainment. But I think that what I'm trying to do is, with the images, it's really kind of sad what I'm trying to do. I just wanted to show where we are in our thinking about changing, the city, or changing the idea, the architectural form, or the architectural sort of relationship to programming life and so forth. So I'm thinking of the MOS's walking city, which actually is an impossible scenario. In other words, if you close all the streets and you put the houses there, of course, then how do you work your way through this labyrinth? And yet it's incredibly interesting also because now the street is dynamic in a different way. And so you are no longer sort of just, sort of either walking the streets or being in the buildings. There's something now that's crossing over in interesting ways, and it would require sort of very interesting sort of ways of passing through this kind of city, a congested city in one way, but also a city that's walking. So I can say a few things about some of the images, but where do I click the images? By the way, oh, down here. There we go. Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay. In the latter part, this should be about 15 minutes or so, I think. If it goes longer, let me know. Okay. But you have to really wave because I'm just not going to be paying any attention. In the latter part of the 20th century, I invited Giorgio Agamben, he's a philosopher, whom I did not know personally, to a conference I organized at Columbia University entitled Part Animal, Architecture and Life. Professor Agamben graciously responded with interest, but also the news that he is currently refusing to come to the United States as a matter of protest because he did not want to hand over the biometric information now routinely demanded at border crossings. Such information seemed at first utterly banal, dated and place of birth and gender, but has now progressed to X-rays and physical searches of bodies. The now relentless collection of information of every kind about our personal lives, which Agamben had predicted, is a symptom, in his view, of how biological life has become what is at stake in the political. Professor Agamben hastened to add, in his response to my invitation, that he had turned down other offers for the same reason, and also that Europe was no better than the United States. Agamben's work was, and still is, concerned with reviving and developing Foucault's thinking in the 1970s about biopolitics and its structural relevance to modernity, sovereignty, and institutions. His long-term project, Agamben's long-term project, about how economic genealogies are connected to early theological systems of governments. Christianity, for example, split divine power into the three parts of the Trinity. On the one hand, there was the ontological matter of beliefs in one divine being, a God or something. On the other, there was everyday management of religion on earth, the attendance to rituals and church rules and regulations, confession, and so forth. This management engages what Agamben, following Foucault, calls an apparatus, the governing system over life on earth that practices that practices bodies of knowledge, measures, and institutions that aim to manage, govern, control, and orient the behaviors, gestures, and thoughts of human beings. Economics is in fact derived from the word oikonomia, mainly to the house, that is, the management of the house, mainly to establish a massive partitioning of being into two large groups of classes. This is, this is what Agamben is doing. He wants to divide the apparatus, this context of the apparatuses to establish a partition between two large groups. And he says it's very crudely divided. On the one hand, living beings, the other apparatuses, in which the living beings are incessantly captured. On one side, the ontology of creatures, our existence, our existential sort of being, and our ontology is on the one side. On the other side, the oikonomia of apparatuses that seek to govern and guide us toward the good, usually toward the good. Thus, we might see architecture as a particularly entwined, ordering apparatus that wishes to guide us, our biological, social, all ourselves, toward the good. Agamben's articulation of both biomodernity and apparatuses, which were first published in small, dense books, and later was he completed it with a larger book, were widely read in many disciplines, including architecture. The immediate relevance of Agamben's work to architecture is, for me, his analysis of biomodernity, a concept that initially followed Foucault biopolitics, as I said earlier. Biomodernity, which necessarily raises questions of our architectural relation, our architectural as apparatus relation to nature with a capital N and nature with a small n. Capital N nature is what we understand to be accessible, organic, picturesque, landscaped, infrastructural, site-specific, propertied, sustainable, the flora and the fauna, etc. Small n nature is the environment and ecosystems at large that we understand very little about, but we are now being faced with. Both concepts concern the role of biological life, our life as humans and other living systems, as well as the evolution of technological systems that architectural work increasingly depends upon, as does our society at large. Agamben begins with how biological life has been somehow captured by political and cultural systems. His fleshing out of the concept of biomodernity in a direction Foucault implied but did not follow, more toward the animal, one might say more toward the diversity of species in a sense, inflects in important ways on architecture's formal, aesthetic, and functional attention toward the complex living systems integral to its realization. How the architectural program, with its tidy typologies of living, has kept life out of its thoughts is due in part to the systemic character of spatial organization and its ability to be separated from design. The program and its typological proprieties make a strong upfront structural appearance in contemporary architectural work, but its destiny has been to become a static, standardized concept wrapped in diverse manifestations of design, form, materials, often charismatic propositions that we are attracted to in every way, but whose floor plates and ordering of space adhere to the humble slowness and routinization of the occupant. The last thing that I want to argue is that architectural programs should dominate the scene of design as more real or empirically more certain piece of the design process. The program is an integral part of an assembly of its agencies codified by nomenclatures, modernism, for example, classical, postmodern, and so forth. It is heavily qualified by attendant chronotropic narratives and influences like precedents, law, organizational matters of the disposition of space according to prevailing typologies in a given temporal moment, historical patterns, and arguments. In all of these epochs, the question of how architecture understands humanity, comes into play in different forms, even before we ascribed the name human to ourselves and gave ourselves the rights of human beings. I think the many attempts of architects and historians and theorists, not to mention the public at large, to discover in our discipline and practice the relationship between architecture and life, to suss out the proprieties and ordering of living, the cultural techniques that aid us in the construction of our milieu, as Robin Evans and Bernard Siegerts have articulated through the concept of cultural techniques. The all too narrow commitment to sustainability, among other issues. All of this testifies to the still uncertain, constantly shifting, complex dilemmas we now face in the biodimensions of technology, uses, and the extraction of energy, environmental crisis, and so forth. Now, Agamben argues, bare life, which he is his name for biological life, natural life, is what is at stake in Western culture. Health systems are now recording our every move. Our identification badges are required for entry into schools and offices. Pictures of us are on our driver's license, connected to large gatherings of data about us. And of course, we are married to the cell phone, which Agamben calls out as an apparatus that affords no outside confessional moment for our commitment to its messages. Biomodernity is not a simple substitution of ecology or biology for formalism or culture, nor is it a sudden revelation about natural systems or sustainability. Instead, it's a polemic, Agamben's polemic, in effect, that studies the complex entwinement of bios, natural life, and zoe, political life that has emerged in the late 20th and early 21st century. And in order to take account of this reversal, architecture's claim for autonomy, for example, during modernist period, meant in the modernist period the freeing of architecture from history and historical precedents in order to establish a contemporary architectural language. This might need to face off against the biological definition of autonomy, which does not mean freedom. Biological autonomy signifies the capacity of living systems to reproduce themselves. The independence of architectural design and the independence of living organisms are connected, but not in the usual way. Is architecture a living system? Not exactly, but living systems compose it in the form of materials and flows through it in the form of animate life of all kinds. It taps into environments and ecosystems whose matter, timber, for example, can be turned toward construction. Is architecture a social system? Yes, but social systems are inextricably, if sometimes obliquely, related to biological lives and ecological systems, resources, and affordances. The discipline and practice of architecture requires inevitably both meaning and energy. The better description would be to say, as many have said, that architecture is technologically implicated, and it means it's overlapping. As with biospheres and mechanospheres are inseparable. And further, architecture still requires, as with all our apparatuses and technologies, living subjects, and that would be us. Vice versa, subjects require apparatuses and organizational technologies. And this pertains to Schrodinger's observation that living systems extract order from their surroundings, which is an incredible remark because the environment that surrounds us is entropic. It's running out of energy. The sun is going, after millions of years, will fade, whereas living systems are expanding as species. And so you have this massive sort of contradictory relationship between the entropic decay of environments and the growth of species. At the same time, the issue of biomodernity, if we can accept that term into architecture for a moment, would seem to be quite different for architecture as such, not least because architecture's relationship to life, culture, and politics is at best oblique and at worst completely opaque. Some claim enormous powers of radicalization for architectural work, and others ridicule and revile the field as utterly complicitous with centralized power structures. It is often the case that architects must thread a complex path through public and private authorities from whom architecture's realization must be won. But just as often, architects lay claim to an autonomy from external authorities that allow architecture to pursue in its own way symbolic and material references to both public and private life. During modernity's reign per se, however, this autonomy, with its increasing emphasis on formal regulation of spatial and material organization, moved closer to a regime of control. Why do we need this provocation? Why do we need to throw architecture into some hyperbolic circuitry of life, bare life, nervous systems, metabolic contexts? We design for people, a public, a generic conception of social life, a typology of subjects such as businessmen, school teachers, affordably housed people. The biological, architects might say, properly belongs to genetic science and medicine, or to psychoanalysis or cognitive research. The biological is an aspect of personhood that is necessary but not sufficient to form what we see as our whole identity. It is perilously close to an essentialist subjectivity that refutes the scientific dependence on objectivity. A provisional answer to these objections is that architecture work itself, throughout its history, has frequently invoked the biological. Architects routinely refer to the experience of space and fields of perception as sensoriums. It is prone to embrace the phenomenological and the empirical. It has designed technical mechanisms and used metaphors that unmistakably refer to metabolic or epigenetic or evolutionary processes. It has embraced research in neuroscience, biology, anthropology, sociology, psychology, in order to manage the confrontation between animate life, and inanimate materiality that pose persistent dilemmas for architectural acts of design and the realization of architectural work. Within these inquiries and engagements, there are multiple aspects of the biological that exceed our simple conceptions of the body or the brain as organic entities. The meaning of the organic is disturbed, and the distinctions between machine, animal, human become barricades that we have kept in place out of powerful fears that architecture will go awry in this territory. But fear of what exactly? Certainly this is an abiding fear of some inchoate animality in human lives, loss of the security of traditional human identities, fear of chaos and disorder in a project of design that is dedicated to ordering, loss of analytic tools such as lines of descent, and loss of rational decision-making, illusions of visual representation, ruptures in binaries and dialectics that support traditions, and so forth. Perhaps it is a fear that is, in fact, has no possibility. Perhaps it's also fear that there is, in fact, no possibility of crossing into the milieu that surrounds and supports the architectural project. We would come to the edge and fall into madness before we could cross that threshold, much as a person afflicted with schizophrenia cannot find themselves in space. The division between living and the milieu is a combination of the ecosystem and the environment in which we live, is not only necessary, but the very basis of our cognitive organization, and yet it's theoretically inaccessible. It's the dark ecology that Timothy Morton named, but it is this gap that supports the emergence of tools in the first place and their evolution into machines, technologies, apparatuses. Architecture often imagines itself as standing at the threshold of these divisions, benevolently managing our passages, but of course it is everywhere involved. So I just want to give you your entertainment, which I did not click through, but this is kind of corny what I'm doing, because on the one hand, these buildings I think are all iconic now and are struggling with the questions that are being asked today. This is, the Kaija Forum by Herzog de Meuron, and you can see it not only has this incredible covering, this green wall, but it also is lifting the building off of the ground and changing the entry to the building in drastic ways. But it turns out it's two buildings. This is the historical building below and the new one on top. So it's stacking up history. And so, I mean, these kind of they're incredible. Herzog de Meuron is an incredibly inquisitive firm that believes that everything is on the table. In other words, we can take Gothic windows and we can put them into contemporary buildings. We don't have to adhere to this contemporaneity. Do you have time for a little bit more? A few more? This is Mark Foster Gage, and this is the Helsinki Guggenheim competition. And in spite of its sort of grotesque character, it's completely symmetrical. And so it's sort of putting symmetry into a sort of hyper Baroque setting. But the peculiarity of this is on the inside, the floor plates are totally traditional. When you see the section, you'll just see floor plates like in every single museum. So that actually that Baroque, symmetrical Baroque character does not pass through the building into the inside. This is always interesting, the caryatids as the human figure holding as a pillar, holding the roof from falling, and above the tomb of one of the kings. And of course, we know this is the classic Corbusier, Nouvelle's commitment of the entire facade of the mode, the monde arabe to eyes, to cameras. So this weird surveillance and sort of just the committing that entire wall to this mechanism that will, sort of click as as you open and close as the sun causes it to. And it's both solar, but it's also, optic solar library, sort of interesting. Peter Eisman, just a few sort of people working through various problem. Encolada Cemetery, which was about trying to represent death, and Wang, his person who got the Pritzker Prize, I think, last year for this Ningbo Museum. And lastly, Ensemble with a concert pavilion that they molded out of earth. So I think that this is where architecture is, and it's not unaware. It's very alert to the issues that we're doing. But the next thing I'm going to show, which I'm not going to talk about, is about where we are in architecture, in my opinion, when we talk about environment and ecosystems. I looked it up on Google just randomly, and this is what came up as what it is, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. This is the level that we're now at in relationship to these serious systems that we cannot know, but that at the same time we are within and working all the time around. So that's all.
Thank you very much. I think this nicely introduces our third speaker, that is Lydia Calipoliti. There is an architect, engineer, and scholar whose research focuses on the intersection of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. She's an associate professor at the Cooper Union here in New York, is the author of Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit, and the History of Ecological Design, and she is the editor of Eco Redux, an issue in architectural design published in 2010. Her work has been awarded, published, and exhibited widely, including the Venice Biennale, Istanbul Design Biennial, Shenzhen Biennial, Oslo Architecture Triennale, and so on and so forth. She's the principal of Anacycle, research think tank, which has been named a leading innovator in sustainable design with various awards. She was the co-curator of the 2022 Tallinn Architecture Biennale, and she will speak a little bit about that today. And that was a winning project of the designer, and she won the Designer Educators Award in 2023. She holds a diploma in architecture engineering from AUT in Greece, and a Master of Science from MIT, and a PhD from Princeton. Thank you very much for being here, Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Athena, for this invitation. It's really great to be here with Catherine and Francesca. And I met Francesca when she was working for Kuzark and writing a review of the Tallinn Architecture Biennale. And she was the only one that included our crazy children, all the curators and the designers, and they were running around. And that's the invisible part of our work that never gets mentioned, but you did. So thank you for that. I'm going to show you a little bit of this project, the Tallinn Architecture Biennale, that I co-curated with my friend Areti Marcopoulou, who's the director of IAC in Spain. And the title that we chose for this project is Edible, or the Architecture of Metabolism. And we wrote this application during a time, the very early stages of the COVID pandemic, where There were empty shelves in the supermarket, and the question of where our food comes from became very vital. It made us think of the fragility of our production processes, how things come to us, what is the logic of distribution, and really urged us to think of alternative forms of organization of different biological networks and material and circular economies. So in Edible, we approached food both literally and metaphorically. On the one hand, we analyzed the byproducts of urban life, namely livestock, agriculture, and forest residues as resources. And on the other, we analyzed, on the one hand, we analyzed local production, self-sufficiency, and urban agriculture. And on the other, the byproducts of urban life, like residues, urban mining, and resources in ways that we may limit material loss and explore alternative pathways. And we were interested in food because it's a topic that is kind of inherently interscalar and interterritorial. It links the stomach to the territory, environmental inequality to the stomach, and it brings together a lot of different realities that we take for granted through this visceral way of eating every day. If we think of the agri-food industry and the global food system, it is one of the most immoral and polluting industries of greenhouse gases in the world. And as the need for food continues to grow in response to increasing urbanization, the alienation between people and their sources of provisions also grows. We continue to consume and produce our edibles by reinforcing carbon dependency, unaware of the links between sourcing, producing, and distribution in ways that we don't know how we consume the food. We are restrained from the journey of the edible arriving to the table. So if we take this image as an example, and that's my dire note on this post-anthropocentric panel, chickens have quadrupled in size 4 times in the last 50 years. And it shows us this very simple diagram that we raise and alter living organisms just so that they become food, if you may call that food. And we have developed food systems that require the physical alteration of other living beings to support the logistical machines of industrialized agriculture. So in the biennial, and this is just very brief, introduction, we envisioned an architecture that produces resources, digests its waste, and decomposes. This paradigm radically intervenes and recomposes the extractive, consumptive, and contaminating logic of the built environment. So within the context of so many crises today, the climate crisis, we just came out of the public health crisis, and social inequity, the idea of a world where resources can be recirculated is vital for planetary habitability. So by eating, we ingest the planet, and the planet in turn becomes the repository of our excretions. This very savage and primordial relationship of interdependency is sensed because of architecture that in many ways becomes the medium where resource consumption and decomposition, as well as body sheltering and micro/macro evolution of climate change is registered. So in the Biennale, we had 3 different thematic entities in the curatorial exhibition: the micro scale of materials that we called From Brick to Soil, the macroscopic scale of territories that we called Food and Geopolitics, and the mesoscale of habitation, the metabolic home, where domestic programs were designed as ecosystems in a feedback chain of resource exchanges. With the metabolic home, we wanted to redefine the concept of habitation, urging visitors to participate in a curated living experiment. There were 7 installations, each of which we invited 7 architects to build each room, and they were asked to exhibit how metabolic processes that they were assigned with related to food, and they were linked with everyday domestic spaces and activities. We were interested with the idea of the house as a kind of microcosm of the world at large and a test bed of how resources could be recirculated. So the house was in many ways an allegory to larger as well as smaller spheres of action, but it was also at the same time an intimate space, an inhabited space that brought ideas of recycling and regeneration to everyday life, to something recognizable to everybody. To build the house, as I said, we assigned different programs, and there was a prerequisite that all of the parts would communicate with each other. So they would be able to receive the waste of another room, of another program as input and convert it to a resource as output. So, for example, the kitchen was the place of processing organic matter, while the garage was a place to upcycle the leftovers of other rooms. Each domestic space was part of a larger ecosystem and interacted with the other house parts in a feedback chain of resource exchanges. So, producing food was presented in a vertical robotic garden, and this was the kind of room, the garden room of IAC and their robotic fabrication program. Processing food was presented in an interspecies kitchen. This is a project of Andres Hake, who's the Dean of Columbia University um, and head of the Office for Political Innovation. Ingesting food was presented in a rewilded dining room by Haley Eber and Mei-Ling Loco from the Cooper Union. Digesting in a lounge that had an edible outer envelope from Terraform One. Hydrating in a toilet that endlessly recirculated and filtered water by Caroline O'Donnell from Cornell, and breaking nutrients in a vertical terrace for harvesting by Estonian architect Sile Pilek. Upcycling also in a garage that was made of a material from char, carbon negative voxels from a German architect. So the idea of the house as a regenerative system prompts this very, very old model. This is William Stump's metabolic home in 1989, and he was a Minnesotan designer who was invested into furniture design and ergonomics mostly to explore energy efficiency and local looping of water and biowaste. In his own words, our houses should have a digestive system just like we do. And the principle that he was using was not rooted in biomimicry, like mimicking natural system and transposing them basically to artificial systems, but rather in understanding what are all the alternative patterns of energy reuse and consumerism that can be rerouted. So this portrayal of the house urges viewers to look at debris, the waste of our own production processes, in a visceral, embodied way, via the raw ecologies of our bodies and the understanding that these problems are not just statistical and abstract, disembodied, far away from us, but they are relayed from the management of urban resources onto bodies, landed on bodies, to the food that we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. We were also interested in the reconstruction of the house as a living machine, generating new kinds of spatial alliances between parts and programs, between, let's say, kitchen waste and a bathtub, a toilet and a garden, a bioreactor and a bathroom. These kinds of new programmatic and experiential alliances display reasons, modes, and trajectories for existential change. Habitation is reconceptualized as a process of transferring and transforming spaces where dichotomies and distinctions like inside versus outside, body versus habitat, habitat versus environment are systemically transfigured. So, to take a small historical turn, we can see an example of a very early living machine. This is the Ark of Cape Cod that was built by the group The New Alchemists in 1976 in Massachusetts. It was a miniaturized ecosystem for alternative food production, coming from the belief that it could serve as a lifeboat for biological diversity and autonomy, like Noah's Ark, if the existing agriculture system on Earth would fail. This was one of many arks that the New Alchemists built at that time. And there was a very famous one in Canada, in the island of Prince Edward. And they were living communities and material test beds for the coexistence and interaction of different species as experiments of practicing year-round controlled agriculture, aquaculture, and passive solar heating. The goal was to maintain and calibrate fragile ecosystemic balances of a contained livable interior environment in harsh climates and to sustain a small colony of people. Both of the people that were in charge, John Todd and William McLarney, were marine ecologists, and they were transferring principles from wetland ecologies to inhabitable microenvironments that they called and later on patented as living machines. Architectural decisions, interestingly enough, in many ways were physical tools that enabled what they called a nourishing thermal mass that empowered productive associations between species, animals, and microorganisms. It was understood, the discipline of architecture, by the group as the fusion of boundaries between organic and inorganic elements, the calibration and construction of a composite living world where, for example, bacteria would feed from the very material that articulated the boundary of a wall. This conceptual model for architecture was directly opposed, and they were saying this very clearly, to Le Corbusier's metaphor for a machine for living, and announced the arc as a kind of performative living environment with corporeal and measurable input and output. So it was the group's intention to outline what they called a living form, one that would have, and these are their words, spatial form and morphic order, end quote, at the same time. And again, in their words, quote, in defiance of entropy, energy could be harnessed to work on the side of life, end quote, or to design life anew. So going back to the Biennale, we had, I hope that this works, we created at the beginning of, at the opening, there's no sound, but I think it's okay, a performance that where different actors would inhabit the house and would exemplify how it's fine. It's just some music from a DJ. They exemplified how they would take the output of one space and use it in the other space. And the performance was directed by an Estonian food artist called Maria Adair in collaboration with us. And the music actually was good, but it's fine that we don't hear it. So a lot of the installations, just to give you a few notes while this is happening, since we don't have music, in the table, there were special tools of accessing the food, and the dining room was an idea that food exists 24/7. It doesn't just come to the table prepared, but it is there. There's mycelium, there's roots, there's herbs, there's stuff that can be combined in different ways, and there's special tools to access this kind of raw material. That toilet, which looks more like a chandelier, was recirculating water in a kind of closed loop. Move forward. And it was a really interesting discovery. People just jumped after the exhibition and ate everything and scooped rice from the floor. I mean, you were there and you know what happened. And we thought they were crazy. Like, I mean, how is everybody so hungry? But it was something that kind of fostered in a very interesting way a visceral engagement, and it was a very powerful instrument that food is a question that engages biopolitics and design, and the proximity with the materials that were being exhibited, which is kind of canonically distant in an exhibition space, was just not there. So how am I doing on time? Should I show the two other sections too? So in the In the smaller scale, which we called breaks to soil, the aim was to magnify the significance of being aware of the origin, process, use, and destination of built matter. With a focus in the microscale of materials, the section was a laboratory of experimental solutions for building prototypes between natural and artificial, and the projects presented were the outcome of programming, hacking, or adapting natural growth and harvesting processes within the goal to generate buildings and landscapes that produce food, become nutrients and food, and enhance biodiversity. So this was a kind of mycelium wall from a company called Mycene, an Estonian company, and their manifesto is about decay, that basically this is returned somehow, even using Marx's rhetoric of the metabolism as a return to the soil, that the walls kind of return to the soil. But from the other side, they're also exhibiting how the mycelium grows in a kind of closed chamber to become hardened when it dies off, basically. So it showed a kind of expanded life cycle of this process. This was another example of that, which was called Root Skin by Chiara Farinea, and it consisted of a network of vegetable plant roots creating a perforated membrane used to filter light in buildings and public spaces. It was grown on a wooden structure covered with a layer of soil to cultivate plants, and it was milled with a pattern wherein water percolated through soil deposits, guiding the growth of roots and defining the membrane's perforation configuration. So it was something between growing and designing based on the milled patterns that were there. In food and geopolitics, we investigated large-scale territories, planetary phenomena, territorial actions with maps, drawings, films, visualizations of mass migration and food sourcing in challenging environmental conditions and zones of conflict. From local ground-up material banks to cultural practices rooted in the land and food injustice driven by ecological transformation, food and geopolitics highlighted the interdependencies of food systems, culture, political economy, and geography. So Black Almanac, which is this project, was a speculative manifesto for 2050 on neurogastronomy, where they invented this fictional notion of terra preta as a living architecture for plant growth that was entirely synthetic. And they introduced concepts that recur within the course of research from neurogastronomy, flavor engineering, and post-farm food, but also blended categories from infrastructure to genetics, culinary philosophies, marketing, and microbiology, crucial to the task of feeding a population of 10 billion in ways that might be nutritious and equitable. This project called Fat Economy was that was one of my favorite ones. It was about the economy of fat as a design system for rethinking the value of oil waste and fat produced in commercial kitchens. So the designer that did that, he was from Britain. He tracked all the kind of grease and fat that was coming out of commercial kitchens in London, and designed a hybrid system that intervened in the traditional recycling processes, which sees the waste stream of oil and fats transformed into biofuel. Creating a close alliance with craftsmen, waste collectors, biofuel producers, chemical scientists, and local fast food chains, the project pulled together a community of differing specialisms to imagine and consume and produce cycles that enable different applications from the same waste stream. As a result, biomaterials are created to replace plastics and consistently produce biofuel. At the same time, are we there? Okay, I'm going to close with a quote by this. We were interested to expand the concept to writing because we're editing a book on this topic, and we had a series in eFlux. And I'm just going to end here. Basically the kind of prompt of that eFlux was how can the idea of digestion reshape urban environments, and how it would take exploring the way that agricultural systems, culinary art, and digestive processes are conditioned by built environments, and how the built environment can itself become subject to cultivation, harvest, and consumption. So we invited a number of authors, and I'm just going to leave you with this very interesting quote by Mark Wigley, who wrote a fantastic text on sewage systems in the 19th century and how infrastructural systems of waste disposal operate in the urban realm. And he writes, digestion is construction, self-construction. We build ourselves by digesting the world, swallowing solids, liquids, and gases to break down and filter them, retaining materials vital for survival and expelling the rest. Sucking, breathing, digesting, and excreting are an urgently good idea from the moment the original plumbing of the umbilical cord is disconnected. In fact, digestion makes possible all the ideas that supposedly makes us uniquely human. Less obviously difficult or even impossible to accept, the digestive system that builds us is, strictly speaking, not inside us. It is 25 feet or so of gut that passes from mouth to anus, and it is not really inside the body. Rather, it is part of the outside world that passes through us. More precisely, digestion turns the outside into an inside. Our organism is never simply put in the world, but it is an intricate unfolding of outside into an inside. More precisely still, it is a fold that produces the very sense of an outside by constructing an interior seemingly detached from it. So thank you so much.
I'm gonna invite Lydia and Catherine here on the stage. Unfortunately, Francesca has to leave us, but she kept nodding during Lydia's presentation. We'll hear more from her, but that's definitely, I would say, what's post-anthropocentric architecture from Francesca. Thank you so much, and let's migrate to the. Yes, please. And can you pass me that? All right. Well, conscious of time, so I'll keep the conversation we'll condense some of the questions that I had, and then I will give some time to the to the guests to participate. I guess we see a lot of overlaps and connections between the presentations that we had today. We've identified the importance of posthumanist theory in architecture. In a way, it felt as if the presentations by Catherine and Lydia really were questioning systems and environments, applying either explicitly or not posthumanist thinking. There still seems to be a shared consensus on architecture's shared interest in biological systems and forms, questioning humans or architects' role in the Anthropocene. And I think what's interesting possibly is the fact that there isn't a shared consensus in terms of, say, architects' alliances with other species. Catherine has anticipated some of that, and I really want to take this time to, in fact, uncover some of these sort of possibly skepticism around this subject. It felt from Francesca's presentation and Lydia, of course, that there is interspecies alliances and kinship systems or multi-species coexistence and cohabitation are indeed important or can be incorporated in the design process or very important to sort of tackle problems associated to the Anthropocene. But in terms of Catherine, I felt that there was a bit of reticence here. She mentioned that architecture isn't a living system, but a social system that is intimately related to biological ones. So I think my question has two different sides. On the one hand, I believe that post-anthropocentrism or post-anthropocentric design raises the question who we are designing for or with. Should architects design for or with other forms of biological life? Should they concern themselves with the creation of architectural ecosystems that may generate resources that can be consumed by a multiplicity of living beings? And it's really, I mean, Lydia's work is about activating non-human actors in the design process, changing even architecture's life cycle as we've conceived it so far. You can literally eat the architecture that is created. Your metabolic house almost seems to even overcome the typical old modernist programming, right? The creation of programs within the house, although there's still a kitchen, a living room, a bathroom, etc. So I think that's interesting there. And I conclude the second part, and then I'll give you some space. We can acknowledge all that architecture was born as a deeply dehumanist and anthropocentric discipline. So do you believe that these solutions, this species egalitarianism that they might achieve, or in fact, or this post-anthropocentric turn in architectural thinking and design is truly achievable in the very little time that we have left due to climate change and all the various dangers that Francesca also has anticipated in her talk.
Is this open? Yeah, is this working? I think, I mean, I was very interested in what Lydia was talking about too, and the way in which food moves through and constructs, systems, and at the same time as sort of it's absolutely essential that it be present, but at the same time it has to be manufactured or grown somewhere, and so it has this long cyclical sort of relationship that flows in and out of cities. I mean, it's absolutely incredible that in New York City, every single store is full of food all the time. How can this possibly be? You don't, it's like crowdsourcing. It's like a kind of emergent system that just plays out itself with trucks and trains and all sorts of stuff, right? So it's so therefore it strikes me as because it's an emergent system, and which works, although there are probably many things about it that could be better, or the food could be better, or all sorts of things could happen with it, that how to allow for emergent systems to develop in relationship to what is, it's also Uber is another example of an emergent system. Nobody planned that, it didn't come from the mayor's office. It didn't come from federal office. Somebody thought one day, well, why don't we have everybody drive their cars around and drive people around and get paid for it? And, and you think, wait a minute, I'm not going to get in anybody else's car. And yet it works brilliantly in some way, right? It actually allows for new, different kinds of jobs and so forth. And it has its problems as well. But that kind of emergence is all over the place happening. And I think it would be fantastic to, I mean, you can't dictate it, but what you can do is begin to recognize it to some degree and encourage it if it seems to be beneficial. How architecture plays into emergence, there was a lot of discussion about that in the 90s for sure, and emergent systems and how, and particularly during digital period, how you can play with that. And I think that we are so in architecture are so careful to make sure everything is known, that it's all coming out of the sort of legitimate places, that we are very cautious of sort of leaving any space sort of unoccupied or somehow open to other possibilities. Although look at all the space around us, it's kind of open, but it's not deliberately, it's not allowed to somehow go other places. So that's again, I think a part of this ordering issue is you have to allow chaos in to a certain extent in order to push space out of its own sort of long-standing, sort of representation of this room or that room or whatever.
Yeah, what's your thought about the possibility of multi-species cohabitation? Is that truly achievable, you think, on the long run with short time that we have left as designers?
That's a simple question. Look, one of my favorite quotes, and it's interesting that we were talking about the post-human in the first presentation, is by Donna Haraway. And she says at some point in one of her texts on tentacular thinking, we're all compost. We're not post-human, but we are part of the world. We are shit and compost. And that's very dire, but at the same time, it kind of brings everything back to a kind of very visceral material reality. And I think it's very important to think in that way, not just technologically and materially, but also politically, what that means. Because yesterday in my class in Princeton, we're visiting this semester, I was talking to Barbara Penner. I don't know if you know her. She's a very very good architectural historian from the Bartlett in London. And in our discussions, we were talking about like how the systems, the kind of infrastructural piping systems that regulate waste and all of the things that we take for granted were developed historically. And they were based, and we were talking about like letters, and they were based on theories of disease, on miasmic diseases, and then there was germ theory. And some of these theories are no longer real, like they're no longer true. We have surpassed them. And I think there's an incredible, these systems, infrastructure is so deeply entrenched, the way that we design, that everything, Zizek famously says, you flush the toilet, everything goes away. And it's carried to a shithole in Alabama that travels with a train from New York to Alabama. And there's a question of displacement of matter, of energy, which is political, right? Because it goes to disenfranchised populations. And it's so deeply entrenched in the way that we institutionalize policies, we understand how things should be done. And it seems unavoidable or something that cannot change. But it can change, right? If we live with our waste inside the building, if it doesn't go into the municipal system, and we invent systems and we design them well, and there is a technology to do so, it would change very much the politics of how the city could operate, right? Because it would be, the infrastructure would be decentralized. So there are a lot of repercussions, but it is the way that we perceive realities, and then they become canons and norms and parts of codes and legislations, and are very deeply entrenched, not just in legally, but all in the psyche and the mindset of how people think of certain things like disease. So I think that we need to really foster, enable different paradigms and show how some things are absurd, right? That buildings that are completely insulated are absurd because they kind of trap pathogens. They don't have engagement. They are good for reducing thermal loss, but they create all sorts of other problems. And there are a lot of absurdities that are built in. Like at some point, asbestos used to be really good. There are ads that say that asbestos was fantastic for as a very strong material to build with. So now multi-species have become very, very popular. And Catherine, you were talking about animals and multi-species like long before it was popular in your work. And Yeah, but you were analyzing it in a very precise and beautiful way. And it's really, really important work because it shifted the attention from the eye of the human to other beings, which is part of this process in the environmental humanities and in philosophy. So I don't know, like it's I don't know if it's possible, but I'll give it a go.
Wonderful.
About the spider and the fly. Okay, because the spider and the fly, in fact, other species don't have cross-species relationships. The spider does this web, and the fly runs into it, and then the spider eats the fly. But they don't know about each other. In other words, the fly cannot see. The web is built in order to in such a way that the fly's optic talents will not see it, and yet it doesn't. And so how does this come about that the spider knows about the fly enough to build this web to catch it, and that it won't see? And how does the fly could just continue to fly into it indefinitely and get caught in the trap? So it's like, I feel that architecture is like that in a way. We have our web, we have our systems, we have our linearities, we have our, our sketches, we have our techniques and everything. And in a certain sense, we know nothing of the fly that's coming in or something, or we know nothing about it, and yet it controls, other species just the way we're controlled by it. So I think it's kind of, I don't think cross species is possible to curate. I think it is something, I know all the work on the bats and everything that people have been doing and stuff, it's just a disaster. I mean, it's like, it's a mess. And and in one way you feel for it. I like what you said about, I think I totally agree with you about the, the waste and actually all sorts of opportunities to sort of change the way we handle ourselves in our particular structures. So I think destructurally, restructuring everything is really, would be great. But I do think also, yeah, anyway, so the spider and the fly suggest that species
Don't need to. Well, that's very interesting. Makes me think of something you've written about expanding human legal system to the animals, and I'll come back to that by introducing something that I actually started with a conversation with Francesca Ferrando when she was thinking about architecture and post-humanism, and she sort of told me that the most post-humanist move that architects and engineers could do would be to not build at all and reuse what's existing in the environment. I mean, in general, cities are abandoned and so on and so forth. So that led to something to the issue of conservation and I think that in Lydia's work, of course, there's part of reflections on ecological conservation of the closed loops, for example, in your previous work, and the paradox of the airtight buildings that you have just explained, which is you said it's an absurd conservative ethic in your writings. Francesca believes once again that sort of conservation reuse of architecture is important. Catherine, wrote a little bit about the connection between posthumanism and preservation in architecture, if I'm not mistaken, by raising questions of time and temporalization. So I really wanted to open this up because that also goes back to this notion of nature's conservation and humans' effort to, in a way, protect animals and plants. You argued in some of your writing that we adopt a humanist viewpoint in this sense, especially when we open up to animals' rights and plants' rights. We try to be protective, and you said something quite interesting. You speak about the fact that this is odd, almost impossible, because of different cognitive systems that are of course, we have from humans and animals and etc. And you also say that it's almost as if we're trying to colonize other species by imposing a human legal framework, conservation framework. So I really wanted to hear your opinion about this question of conservation and in the light of post-anthropocentrism or thinking design.
If you want me to, I just want to, it was so striking when you were showing these last images, like Googling sustainability, what we found, right? And
So sad.
oh, is it not working?
It's working.
Oh, yeah. It's, I'm not sure if it's sad. I'm more suspicious, it's because there was always like the earth is always held by human hands. There's always like that kind of supremacy of omnipotence of that we can save that. And I also found images of like people holding the earth that's like a fragile, cute little baby. It's not. It's gonna eat us all up because we are the fragile disappearing species on this planet. And I think that logic that we can design for the bats better homes and design for I have contested feelings about designing for other species. On the one hand, I support it. I think it's really interesting and important to engage with other species and provide environments. On the other hand, I think we should think of alliances and interdependencies rather than the eye of the human supremacy to create an environment for these others.
Figure out how to leave them alone.
Um,
I mean,
That
there.
too.
I mean, what? It's disastrous when they come into our framework or whatever. We start doing things to them, and we start putting all sorts of radar stuff around them so that we can track them through their day. It's like, what? You want to be flying around with all sorts of apparatuses so somebody's spying on you, whatever. It's I'm being dramatic, but how could we leave them alone, and actually partition the earth in some way that would allow for everything to be there, not as it is now. There would have to be ways of sort of managing that, and I have no idea how that would how we could do that, but seems as if they should have their world just like us.
It depends, like we can talk about this over dinner, I guess, but because it's a long discussion.
It is.
Because in cases like the degradation of natural habitats and, all of these conspiracy theories about where did COVID come from, and it was because we transgressed the boundaries of, natural habitats and so forth. In certain categories of species, we should.
For airplanes.
But on the other, like certain kinds of moss that grow and, kind of regenerate atmospheric content, or there are alliances. I really believe that. I believe that there can be ways to create different kinds of programmatic relationships, of existential relationships, and build forms that are founded on interspecies alliances, not necessarily with those bats that should be left alone and where they are, and all of these birds, but maybe it's not even animals, it's bacteria species, matter, and
It's very
it's complicated.
Very complex. Very complex. Yeah. Do you have questions here?
Oh, okay, absolutely, yes. Since we have 10 minutes, I think,
anyway.
left, would be, yeah, we can definitely start to talk about exactly what I really wanted to hear from you. So I'm very happy. And of course, we can open up to the audience, both present and online. Well, if you can rate, yes. I can give you the
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations and discussions. I have two questions for one presenter each. So first, Catherine, I really appreciate the very philosophical and ontological inquiries. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I know. I would just say I really appreciate the very philosophical and ontological inquiry of the existence of architecture, like at the like in between stage between to think about, for example, living and milieu, thinking about entropy and growth, among others, and that forms a different kinds of architecture inquiries that feels disconnected from the loss of the Google images that like from outside of architecture discipline will be expecting of us, right? For example, more of the problem solving. So I was very surprised to see Francesca in her presentation, she was landing on like really how architecture can promote interspecies awareness, or how do we create existential dignity for all. But that part seems very disconnected from the really wonderful ontological architecture inquiries of reflecting upon itself. So I was thinking if you have further thoughts about how to connect them or make them useful, or if they should be just left alone. And then for Lydia, I really appreciate when you were talking about Donna Haraway and we're all post, there's like the materialistic aspect encompasses all in the connections of different species. And later you were mentioning the alliance, right? But with digestion, it is really facing the crude truth that there is this act of one consuming another. Even with the post-human non-anthropocentric problem solving, there's still that problem that is how to survive as a relatively coherent species. There's even more some kind of appropriation of others in that to appropriate some kind of biodiversity interact with multi-species in order to serve for human survival, right? So I'm wondering how that materialistic an alliance and reflections that you have could kind of face that cruelty of digestion of food, of that acts in separation of the consuming and being consumed, and we're actually also eating one another, even when we're talking about posthumanism. Thanks.
If I understand, yeah, I'm not sure if I understood your question entirely, but I realize that I am still incredibly interested in, the mystery of architectural design. I mystify it all the time. It's like this incredible act that is why architecture exceeds the buildings that it's doing. It's doing more than just building. It's like, and yet the building is the central, sort of, it's the central element that that tells us that we're, that we have to figure out as architecture what is, what isn't, does it matter, or whatever. And so, but I'm still think that this active design is so complicated and it's so necessary, and it also can be completely heroic, or it can be, which I think is sad when it becomes so heroic that it no longer is inquisitive. And but it isn't, and the fact that you start with nothing, you start with kind of a void and a whole bunch of precedents, and you begin to sort of play with the precedents, and then you begin to play with, the various, whatever the client's proposing and everything else. And it becomes this just incredible sort of context for the development. And then, of course, to materialize it becomes, it's extremely difficult to do all this all in the same place. And it has to bring in so many other things and other disciplines and everything else, and other forms of knowledge and all this other stuff. So I'm still not convinced that we can forecast anything about the future of what we're doing. I don't, even though we have always wanted to forecast, what we're going to do next or what comes after this one, because I think that futurism is interesting in architecture. Why are we always so interested in the future? We're kind of, because the future for us, for architects, is almost, how would you state that? It's like what we're going to determine what kind of buildings in the future are going to be able to do what we're asking them to do, these incredibly complex things. When Francesca shows, the traditional bubble that we expect to be living in the future or something. I don't know what what bubble you made? What is it, a bubble? Why would we have bubbles? You know, it's supposed to represent this sort of architecture releasing all this crap, you know, all this Earth's heaviness and becoming lightweight and carrying us, and we breathe in it happily, and you know, and so forth. And it's really fascinating, but it is utopic in spite of not wanting to be a utopic. It has to always be utopic at some level. So I still, anyway, I'm not really answering your question per se, but I'm trying to say why, you know, maybe where you lodge this question of the building, or where you begin to point to, you know, potential formations or reformations of building. Let's forget building. Let's reform it. Let's have it architecture now do something far more meaningful or something like that. And so I can't quite get out of, I think I'm sort of really tightly, you know, interested still in that, in the building and the question of building and how design manages that and what it is and what's going on. But I'm admire what Lydia's doing very much, and also everybody who's working on these problems and trying to dissolve some of this hard, you know, this heaviness of the discipline and the practice and take it into other domains. So I'm very interested in that too, but I just am not still kind of, yeah, anyway.
I admire you too. But thank you. That's a really good question. And it made me think, you know, like I had to think for a second before. And it's a very important one, because I think digestion is not more cruel than something like resilience. Because under the framework of resilience, for example, we rejuvenate landscapes and we have plants that look good to suck up all the pollution of toxic riverbeds, right? And these strategies are incorporated in everyday activities, but under a prism that is presented and creating an image of, I don't know, like an icon of the good life. Or so I was thinking about that when I was writing about resilience, and I have a book coming out in January, and it's, you know, it's a very resilience is deeply contested, and it's not as simple as it sounds, right? Like all of these techniques. So digestion is something that is cruel, like shit is, and I had that in the title of my previous book, but it's out there in a very sincere and out front way, right? So it gives you the reality of life without kind of creating a kind of sugarcoating it of, but we engage with these strategies every day. We just label them and coat them and furnish them in a different way. And we use natural species all the time. So there is struggle and battle in life, and you know, interdependency doesn't mean that we all hold hands. It means that there some die and some live, and there's a cycle of life, and that's what happens. But I think the question is how we interpret that kind of event that actually unfolds in reality, and how we design for it.
Wonderful. Fantastic. So maybe we have time for one last question from the public. Are there questions from the online? Yes.
Sorry, I'll step in for the people online. Thank you for 3 really fantastic, eloquent presentations that really stand as like warnings for what we should be doing differently. And I was trying to think, if I was a young person, like in our audience, one of our students, what would it feel like to be warned so eloquently about the future of what it would be to be an architect for the next several decades? And it struck me that as I'm thinking about this, that for decades we've been warned, which doesn't diminish in any way the warnings that you've had from either the enthusiasm of Ian McHarg of designing with nature, or the Club of Rome, and the harsh warnings from the early 70s about the growth of our population, our human population. And it seems that as though in today's world, we're supposed to have learned so much over the years, and we had our pandemic, which was meant to change everything. If everyone recalls, we were meant to rethink everything about how our discipline will engage. So what will it take for our discipline of our profession of architecture to have more respect for not only just us as humans and each other, more respect for living species on our planet, more respect for our planet as a whole ecosystem? What will it take? This has been going on for many decades. Your presentations are absolutely fantastic. But what will it take for our discipline, the teaching of architecture, and the profession to genuinely change? Very heavy question.
Yeah, it's not gonna happen in any, I would say that awareness is not something that suddenly appears on the threshold, and then you kind of, then you jump in the suit of it, and there you go, you sort of, now you know what to do. A lot has changed even since those early, many early sort of projects and thinking about, about the environment back in the 70s and 80s. There was tons of, building the different kinds of places for people to stay in, outside the city and so forth. So I think that it gathers itself, history gathers itself over time, and it reappears. These things, they reappear, and then they get developed in a different way depending on what time you're in. And so the precedents are there, and there's huge amount of experimentation that has gone on in architectural work throughout history. And so that in a way, it's actually always churning in our midst. There's times when we are, architectural schools act very stupidly or boringly or whatever, or they just go down, do the standardized, whatever. And sometimes the standardized, though, just is incredibly interesting, what they do. So it's up, and it's the way, it's not a linear system. It's actually a sort of overlapping all the time. So I would say there's not going to be a moment where we get smart. We're smarter now, let's say through experimentations done earlier, but we can't, it's not going to be driven by, just knowing about it. That's the problem, because we're embedded in what this incredible amount of apparatuses every which way, right? Everything is how we get rid of all this and then make it better, or something, or just get rid of the commodification of everything and all of our consumer stuff. We're going to have to do we can't say, okay, now we're going to do that. We do say things like that. We say, oh, we're going to have electric cars. Yeah. In what is it, 2040 or whatever it is. And we're going to have those. And so everybody gets busy working on that. But we have no idea what it's going to be like to have every car be electric. We're going to have major problems, not just with charging, but also with electricity. And so, and all these kind of rare things you have to serve the batteries, the lithium and everything else. That's going to change the whole geopolitical, management of stuff on Earth. So these are gigantic, sort of, we're all happy. Oh yeah, okay, electric cars, that's going to solve the problem. So it's kind of, we're kind of, we cannot conceive and be suddenly aware. It's going to have to come in just like it's coming in now. It's coming in this way and that way. Some of it gets done, some of it gets expressed, some of it gets articulated, some of it actually happens, and we see what that is. And I mean, so somebody builds the Tesla suddenly, you know, or whatever. So it's like this, the emergence of awareness is, I think, how it's the only way it's going to happen. I don't know how we're going to do it though. It's just, we're so embedded.
I don't know how to answer your question. But I always tell my students to be positive and kind of to retain by all that it's their obligation to be positive, that they don't have a choice. And you have to be both critical and generative at the same time. And that is a very fine line and a fine balance. But if you're just critical and you're, it halts the creativity. But that doesn't mean that that's a factor that induces change necessarily. That's much more, it's how change occurs is very complicated and multifaceted, and we definitely cannot answer this right now. But
The environment will teach us.
well, I thought that the pandemic, like when we were kind of like in the lockdown, I was reading Georgia Gonbeck and Zizek about the second stage of global melancholia, the third stage, and I was sure that we were never returning to normal. And here we are, we're back to normal. And not only that, there's so much, there are wars everywhere. There's constriction, like in universities, between different camps of people. I think everybody senses that. I was talking to a colleague and we were saying, oh, we missed the pandemic. We were all united against a virus, and we were so sure that things were going to change, and they didn't.
Well,
But-
COVID is still here. And we've been wearing masks, which is very unusual that the whole world was wearing masks. And it's
Yeah.
also,
It was
nobody's
a rare.
forgotten it. And it actually has affected history, because in history, there's a gap, on all sorts of gaps in history because of COVID. We're always going to have missing 3 years of something, many things we missing 3 years of. And that'll be this kind of gap in that history. So it's not nothing.
It is very important, but I know we're out of time, so I'll just say something. It's not the answer to your question, Tom, but it's something that inspired me. I'm a big fan of Ursula Le Guin's books and novels and writings. Do you know Ursula Le Guin, like the science fiction writer that Donna Haraway talks about? And I was lucky enough to see her and listen to her in a talk in New York before she passed. And she received a major book award. I think it was 2014 or 13 in New York City. And she said, she was talking about the obligation of creative thinkers as citizens. And, she was saying that at some point in time, the reign of kings seemed inevitable and inescapable. And now the power of capitalism seems inescapable. But kings have fallen, and things will change. We don't know exactly when and how, and maybe it will be a procedural trickling down of many different changes. But nothing is set in stone. And
It's
it
changing
gave me
this
hope.
minute, every second. It's changing. So
Yeah.
Well, I guess we are sort of moving towards some more existential questions, but I thank very much our speakers, and thank you, the audience, for staying with us until this point. And well, thank you very much, and have a good night.